Hi guys, Mandy here. I'm going to be telling you a bit about my text set and why I chose which readings I did. First of all, you'll have to excuse my presentation a little bit as my power is out. So we are going to have some mood lighting for the rest of the presentation. First of all, I constructed my text set for the AP Spanish class that I have. I chose the AP Spanish class because their reading level is at a much more... Oh my gosh, it came on! This is so exciting! So as you guys can see, my power just came back on, so lucky for you, you get better lighting now. Anyway, I chose my AP Spanish class because their reading level is a little bit higher. A lot of my other Spanish classes are barely at a picture book reading level, so this gave me some more variability. As well, I conducted the closed assessment in my AP Spanish class, so I had that idea of where each of them were at with their readability. So with the closed assessment, it's important to note that everyone in the AP class scored at a frustration reading level, including the native speakers. This is mainly because of the text I chose. It was not something they were familiar with, even though I believed they were. As well, I removed too many words in the closed assessment. I should have left a few more in, and I think that would have helped all the students complete the closed assessment and finish it with less frustration. As well, I chose the AP class because their units are a lot more designed for working with a bunch of different types of reading. For example, most of what the AP Spanish class does throughout the year is study the different cultures and literatures literature of Spanish-speaking countries. So with that in mind, I chose to do Argentina because they've actually done a little bit on Argentina and a little bit about their culture already. So I decided to conduct my unit and my text set around Argentine culture. So the first text I chose was Le gustaría a Malfalda el tango by Carmen Teria. This is actually a blog post. It is not a formal text. It is rather informal. I chose this because of that. I felt it was a good way to start the reading or start the text set with something that was informal, that would give them a very good overview of Argentina and the culture as a kind of way to start. As well, Carmen Teria in this blog, she is a Spanish speaker who of a native of a different country that comes to Argentina to visit. She does all the tourist things, but she also compares the different cultures to other Spanish-speaking countries, and she offers pictures and everything else throughout it. So that is why this is a narrative/picture book for my first text. As well, my first text, La gustaría el Malfalda el tango, the blog, is at an 8.4 readability level, which is 7th or 8th grade. I wanted to start with an easier reading for the kids so they can kind of work up their content or work up their confidence in reading. And so the next text I chose is actually a podcast. It's not a text. It is called El Tango, and it is by the Spanish Audio Gazette. I wanted to do a podcast or some kind of audio component into my text set because I believe that listening comprehension is so important to learning a second language. And in the AP Spanish class that I'm in right now, they don't seem to be doing a lot of listening or speaking or anything of that kind of manner in the class. A lot of it is a lot of heavy reading and writing. So I wanted to get the students, listening to something a bit more. The podcast is also pretty easy to listen to. It's not too bad. It's very, very general and broad. It does focus on el tango, but it focuses on the origins and influences. So there's a lot of cognates in there that students can pull out if they're having trouble really figuring out what the podcast is talking about. Because it is so information driven, it is an expository type of text. So, adding on to that, my third text would follow right up to it. It is El Tango, Apunte Histórico. This one is very similar to the previous text or the podcast before it, but it offers a lot more detail, not just about the origins and influences of the tango, but the views society had towards the tango, the types of people involved in it, which really contributed a lot to Argentine's culture. And I want the students to be able to get a little taste of some of the views society had and the culture that's starting to develop in Argentina at this time. The tango came about in the late 1800s, and it's a very important part in Argentine culture, and it has influenced a lot of other parts of Argentine culture. So this text, very information driven, full of facts. It is also an expository text, and I hope I'm saying that right. So that's why I chose to kind of have those two back to back in case students are better at listening. They have that opportunity to listen to something and still get from it. But in case they're not, they also have this other text that kind of dives a little bit deeper. So either way, students should be able to get something out of the podcast and the following expository text. Following that, my next text I would have is probably one of my favorites. This is El Tango by Jorge Luis Borges. Jorge Luis Borges is like the national treasure of Argentina as far as literature goes. He is huge, or was huge, in the Spanish literacy movement. So I felt it was very important to put a text of his into the text set. I chose El Tango because it kind of keeps with this little theme as we're studying this smaller part in Argentine culture and how it really develops into one of the main aspects, and every part of it is affected by different parts of Argentine culture. This text is really important because I think it's a poem, first of all, and a poem can be difficult for native speakers. I know for me and lots of other native English speakers, poetry is very difficult for some people to grasp, and a lot of our native speakers have not really practiced or utilized their academic vocabulary and academic language in Spanish, so I really wanted them to have the opportunity to expand that and really utilize it. So that's why I chose this poem. I also chose the poem because it dives more into not just how society views the tango, but how the people who really utilize the tango, and that was their way of expression, what they were going through at that time. It was not necessarily a welcomed dance in Argentina. It was considered very sensual, and sometimes the music and the dance were considered very vulgar. The high-end people did not usually dance the tango. It was in the lower income parts of Buenos Aires in Argentina. There were a lot of slaves and immigrants and criminals who really influenced the tango and had it come to be what it is. So Borges describes it as a dance of struggle and sadness, and I think that's really important for the kids to be able to not just see, here's how society looked at it, but here's what the people were going through at the same time. So following Jorge Luis Borges, which by the way is a narrative text, following Borges, I decided to go with the next text, which is a critical perspective text, since we already discussed a little bit about that in the Borges poem. This one is called El Tango como Crítica Social by Héctor Diomede. Héctor Diomede is a professor in El Salvador. It's a very long, in-depth text. I would not assign the full text to students, although it is only a 10.9 readability level, which is 10th or 11th grade. So we're not talking about grad level or anything here, but it is still a second language for a lot of the kids. So I wanted to choose something that would be challenging and work to those different levels of reading, but at the same time, still the kids will still get something from it. So that's why I chose this. It also gives a really good perspective on what society thought of not just the tango, but the immigrants coming into Argentina at the time, the different classes, slaves, all of that stuff at the in Argentina at the time. So it's not just how those things were affecting the tango, but it was also how those things were coming into Argentina, how society was perceiving them, and how those eventually have shaped a lot of the culture of Argentina today. The last text I chose to conclude my whole text set is a current events or news article. It is from El País, which is a Spanish newspaper. It is called La Boca se reinventa a través del arte. This one I really enjoyed, and I also wanted to put it at the end because it brings everything the students have been reading back to current times. It talks about La Boca, which is a neighborhood in Buenos Aires, which is actually known to be home of El Tango. It never was a really, I guess, safe neighborhood, if you will. That is where a lot of the immigrants were, a lot of the slaves, a lot of criminals, and more were at, and that's where tango really developed. A lot of art and music and other things like that came from La Boca. It is also incredibly famous, so when I saw this article, I immediately thought it would be perfect because if the kids were ever going to go to Buenos Aires, they would go to La Boca. It is something they have probably seen already in art. It is something that they will read about in the first blog post to start the unit. So I wanted to kind of finish with that. I also liked it because it brings everything back to modern times. So it talks about La Boca, which, like I said, is that neighborhood. Well, it is reinventing itself through its art, and that's basically what the title says. And it talks about how all these different artists are using their skills and their culture and their heritage to really help reinvent La Boca and put it in a better spot. So this is actually the hardest of all the texts on the readability level. It is a 13.2, which is college entry level. This, I know, will be very challenging for the students because I don't think they've read anything to this extent, but I felt like it was important to introduce it to them, because if they go to college and they do skip levels because they are in an AP Spanish class now, they will be expected to read at this level right away. So, or at least be able to handle these kind of texts right away. So that's why I chose this text. Again, it also brings a lot of those social critiques that are present throughout the other text sets back to this modern time, and how all those have influenced this neighborhood and Argentine culture, and how that has come to be. The last part I want to mention is about the writing to learn activities that I would include in the text set. These are to help aid and support the students as they go through their reading. The first one I would do is a carousel brainstorming. I would do this before we actually started reading the blog. This, I would have, the 3 questions I would have in it are just their general knowledge of Argentina as a country, what do they know? Their knowledge of Argentine culture and society, what do they know? And then about the tango, since that's kind of the more detailed piece that we use to explore Argentine culture as a whole. The next writing to learn activity I would use after the Borges poem, because that's kind of the middle of all the texts, as well as the Borges poem is so in depth and it can be such a struggle to reach because it is such a hardcore literacy piece. I would do with that probably right around, I think with poetry, especially with his poem, which is a little bit more sensitive because it talks about the struggles and sadness that people dealt with. I would do right around because I don't want students to feel that they can't express something, or as well, it's all in their second language, or the majority of their second language. So I would want them to feel comfortable with just putting their thoughts out there instead of having to speak in front of the entire class or something like that. So my last writing to learn activity would be at the end of the unit. I would want the students to do a reflection. The question I would ask is, we've discussed Argentine culture and how society has perceived the tango. The question I would want them to ask, or I would want them to answer, is how do you think society perceives your own culture? How has that changed, and how can you help change that viewpoint of your own culture? So I'm hoping that through the text set and how they see the tango and how it's perceived and how it is added to the Argentine culture in a whole in society, I would hope they'd be able to pull away from it. That is my goal, that they'll be able to put this into their own lives and see how society has perceived their own cultures. So if you have any questions, please post below. If you want to read the paper that is more detailed, please do. And I will see you guys next week.